Gurmagad Lias Ceann Comhairle, and I'm glad to be responding for my first time in this House to a budget. And I want to follow Deputy Nash by saying that I will approach it in a constructively critical manner, Lias Ceann Comhairle, by welcoming what is positive in it, but by noting, however, that so much of the positive change is so piecemeal that although this is a budget that has been largely and widely leaked in advance of its publication, we've seen a drip feed of selective positive piecemeal news. But the reality is that it's a budget that has failed to deliver and that has raised expectations without delivering on any real change. The tax cuts that have been announced today could have been invested in real radical change in public services. But what we have seen instead is the lack of a grand vision, some tinkering around the edges, but a failure to address real structural needs of people. There's been some good news in it, for sure, for those perhaps who are cider drinkers or indeed digital gamers, and that's welcome, but not so much good news for those who are renting, for renters, or indeed for parents seeking to access increasingly unaffordable and scarce childcare places. So we lack a grand vision in this government, Lias Ceann Comhairle. And what we lack and what Labour has proposed is a new deal for a fairer and more equal Ireland and a new deal on care, on climate, on housing and on work. What we lack in this budget is a progressive pathway for delivering real change on these issues. On care and on climate, the two issues on which I want to focus, we lack, as Deputy Nash has said, we lack a transformative vision. And this is all the more a shame when we are coming through COVID, when we have seen what collective solidarity and a collective sense of purpose can deliver, when we have seen the devastation caused by COVID, the loss of so many thousands of lives and the devastation to so many, both in terms of lives and health and also in terms of livelihood. And through this time we've learnt the real value of public services and the real need to ensure good, decent, adequate investment in our healthcare system, in our education, in our childcare system. And that's what we mean when we talk about a new deal for a fairer Ireland. We're talking about the sort of moment that we saw in Britain coming out of World War II with the creation of the National Health Service there. We're talking about the sort of transformative vision that was expressed by Dr. Kathleen Lynn in this country when she talked about a new vision for children's healthcare in Ireland. We're talking about the sort of transformative vision that was exemplified by former Education Minister Donogh O'Malley 55 years ago this year when he announced free secondary education for all children and spoke in the following words that future generations will judge us for what we did for the children of our time. That's the sort of transformational vision, Lias Ceann Comhairle, that could have been delivered in this budget but that it has failed abjectly to do. So on care, we need to see a real commitment to change, to tackle the piecemeal laissez-faire system that has emerged out of the failures by successive governments to introduce a system of universal public childcare and the failure to introduce a high-quality system of community and home-based supports for older persons, a new fair deal, which I have been calling for, to move us away from the prioritisation of nursing home and institutional care and to instead reconfigure the system of subsidy to ensure that older people are given access to supports in their own homes, to stay there instead of having to move into institutional care. We've also seen a failure to introduce a system that delivers for those with disabilities, those experiencing chronic disease and those who need supports. And we failed to see in this budget a new Green Deal, a radical vision on how we get to a point where we achieve our carbon emission reduction targets. On childcare, what I have called for is this transformational moment, and that's what we're not seeing in this budget. Although it was well flagged that there would be much in it for parents, what we see instead is a very disappointing failure to meet those expectations. A figure of 78 million proposed in additional investment in core funding and to reform the National Childcare Scheme, below the €100 million that was flagged in advance. What we've seen in the words of the Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure is a promise of a turning point. But we've seen promises of turning points, Minister, each year for childcare without any tangible effect for those involved. We have seen in this budget again some fine words, but no sign of any reduction in costs for parents who are now paying effectively a second mortgage in fees to creches. Fees for children under 5 running at around €1,000 a month in my own constituency in Dublin Bay South and across Dublin. And we're also seeing a lack of places. So it's not just affordability that's the issue, it's a scarcity of places. And I'm hearing from providers in my own constituency about the difficulties they have in keeping childcare going. And we're also hearing from those professionals and those early years educators about low pay, serious concerns about low pay in the sector. SIP2's Big Start campaign and the New Deal for Early Years Coalition telling us that 42% of professionals are actively now seeking work outside the sector, 78% saying that if things stay the same, they intend to leave within the next year. And low pay is the biggest factor driving people out of this profession. And we're hearing from managers and providers who can't recruit new staff and therefore can't keep childcare open. And so, Minister, what we're seeing is we are failing everyone. Our childcare system, or lack of system, is failing parents, it's failing professionals, it's failing providers, but most of all, most importantly, it's failing our children who do not have access to quality early years education as a matter of right. And that's why we need to move to that Donna O'Malley moment, to see that children under school age require and deserve and should be entitled in this modern Ireland to a free early years place. And that's what we in Labour have called for. And I was proud to launch with Labour Women our call for a universal public childcare model, which we would have in this budget commenced with, starting with a €60 million pilot, a new approach defined by equality for children, affordability for parents and fairness for professionals. And we put forward a clear and costed proposal, Minister, of how this would be rolled out. And this was built around a vision of a universal public childcare scheme. That's what's lacking in this budget. We don't see in this budget any commitment to a pathway to a future where there would be a universal public scheme. We don't see in this budget that absolute commitment to equal early years for children. We do welcome the changes proposed to the National Childcare Scheme, and indeed my colleague Senator Marie Sherlock has really led on this. We welcome that, but again we don't see where it's fitting into the overall structural reform that is needed to fix a system that is failing everyone and that is currently reliant on piecemeal private sector provision. And indeed, there are some questions, Minister. Why is it proposed to extend the scheme to children under 15, and how is that to be done? Why are we seeing such delay on the implementation of decent wages for childcare workers? So there's questions that remain. On disability and care in the disability sector too, we see a failure to meet expectations. As outlined in the recent Disability Capacity Review, an investment of €350 million is needed in 2022 just to meet demographic and unmet demand. And so it is welcome to see additional funding of €105 million announced today, but it's not enough to meet the serious needs that are there for those with disabilities. The Disability Federation has pointed out too how increases in carers allowance and in the income disregard will not meet the real needs of carers and will not help those carers who are not in employment. During the pandemic, we have seen carers and frontline workers as unsung heroes who need supports, and that not enough is provided in this budget. It's welcome also to see a commitment to new SNAs, but I know again in my own constituency, Minister, just how short we are in terms of allocation of places for special needs assistance in schools. And finally, on the Catch Up for Children Fund that we have proposed, that Aodhán Ó Ríordáin and I have proposed, I don't see commitment in this budget to ensuring that there is adequate resourcing put in place, particularly for those children with additional needs who most need to have resources for catching up. And on climate, to conclude on the climate action aspect of the budget, again, what we lack in this budget is a sign of a commitment to delivering a radical vision on climate. Climate should be front and centre. This should be a Green New Deal budget. And that's, I think, what we had all expected. But again, the delivery in this budget fails to meet the expectations that have been raised. We know from the IPCC report in August that we are at code red for humanity. And indeed, the Minister for Finance himself said the world is burning. But there's no sense of that urgency or that need for immediate action or that grand vision to take that action when we look at the small print of this budget on climate. We know that the political will is there. We see it with the school strikes for climate outside the gates of Leinster House every week. We see it from the Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change, 100% of whom recommended the state should take a leadership role and address climate change, that this must be at the centre of policy making in Ireland for all government departments. But again, we don't see that in this budget. We needed to see a more ambitious retrofitting programme and a commitment to a national recruitment campaign to ensure that we have adequate numbers of workers to deliver that retrofitting programme. We also need to see more on just transition. We need to ensure that those who are going to be most hit with carbon tax increases will be adequately, that income will be adequately redistributed. And Labour called for a new carbon tax credit to be introduced, to be refundable and allocated on a household basis and available up to a particular income limit, and to those living in homes with a BER rating of less than B2. We called for this. We called also for increases to the weekly fuel allowance, and certainly those are welcome. But we would have gone further and restored the extra 4 weeks that were paid in 2020. We wanted to see more expansion of eligibility for more households, and again, we didn't see that in this budget. On transport, again, we called for more ambitious programmes, for free public transport for children and for all students, instead of the more half-hearted change we've seen. And certainly it's welcome to see reduced prices for under 23s. But there's a question about how logistically that can be rolled out, Minister, when we have a lack of public transport in so many areas outside of major urban centres. And indeed, it would appear that what we're seeing with the government proposal on public transport is the government proposing to encourage people to use unaffordable public transport, or sometimes unavailable public transport, before it can be made free, to incentivise them to do so. We might call this putting the cart before the horse, or indeed putting the leap card before the bus or train, where leap cards don't extend, or where there is no public transport available. We're short also in this budget on completion dates for flagship public transport projects, and there's been serious concern in Dublin around the Metrolink and when in fact that will be rolled out. And we should have seen front-loaded investment in active travel and city bike schemes. I've been calling for years now, Minister, for the introduction of a bike-to-school scheme, modelled on the bike-to-work scheme, that would encourage more school children to purchase bikes for a commute to school and to move away from over-reliance on private cars for that crucial school journey. Labour in Dublin delivered on the Dublin Bike Scheme. We've seen really strong public infrastructure schemes for cycling along the Grand Canal and in other areas in Dublin. But too many of these infrastructure schemes are piecemeal. And again, what we're lacking in this budget is the sense of a real grand vision for a move away from reliance on private transport and a move to active travel and to public transport measures. We need to ensure that the infrastructure is there to enable people to make that move. And again, some of the changes proposed are just simply inadequate. I see some measure referred to extending of the €5,000 scheme for electric cars, but again, it's not enough to enable people, to support people to make the change and to move to electric cars. We see a lack of provision for electric car charging points. Again, a really serious issue for people who are actively wanting and desiring to make a change and away from fossil fuel reliance in their everyday lives. So, Minister, what we've seen in this budget overall is too much that is piecemeal, too much that is based on short-termism, on sort of short-term thinking that we in Labour have been critical of, and too little in terms of a commitment to the real structural changes that are so sorely needed in so many areas, but particularly in those crucial areas of childcare, of care more generally, of care for older persons and care for those with disabilities. And we see tokenistic and piecemeal change put forward in this budget on so many other areas too, on climate and indeed on education and on health, as Jed has said. So, Minister, what we're calling for is a grander vision, a new fair deal for a fairer Ireland, and a new fair deal for a more equal Ireland, in which we're seeing the funding that was being invested in tax relief put instead into delivery of high-quality public services. The budget that we needed in 2022 is a budget that delivers real change for people across Ireland, and that's not what we're seeing in this inadequate, flawed and under-ambitious budget. Social Democrats, ich habe zu Roisin Shortall.